So basically the talk picks up on some of this feminist epistemologies that were roughly 30 years ago, as you mentioned in this text, with a brief outline of those general tendencies, but with the aim, of course, to update them for our current techno-historical situation, as you were sort of alluding to in your talk, in a slightly different way, I will say, but nonetheless still updating it. So a paradigm of knowledge-making that demands distributed cognition. So it's fairly new material, so you're going to have to bear with me on a few loose ends and be a bit kind in the grilling afterwards. I'll do my best. But ultimately, it's a kind of proposition to relativize the relativization of knowledge claims that in part come out of this feminist epistemological tradition, but that can then hopefully weave into a project called Inhumanism, which I'll be defining all of this, and hopefully it's clear. If it's not, we're a small group, so just like get out of your chair, raise your hand, say something, and if you feel more comfortable addressing me in French or German, no problem to do so. Happy to clarify. Okay, so there are basically two quotes that form the backbone from this talk. So the first one is serendipitously taken from Donna Haraway's seminal text, Situated Knowledges from 1988, which to me stands out as an ongoing plea for the political import of epistemic endeavors. And really important here is that she doesn't renounce objectivity tout court. Yeah, and I think that there's been a tendency to take this text, it's almost so ubiquitous people don't read it anymore, and they just assume it's like a demonizing of objectivity. She's like, no, we need to preserve it, but we need to redefine it and reframe it. The quote goes like this: feminists have to insist on a better account of the world. It's not enough to show radical historical contingency and modes of construction for everything. So the second quote is from a philosopher, Ray Brassier, who was here last year, was it? Mm-hmm. Yeah? You were lucky to have him. He's fantastic. And this is a quote from his text from Concepts and Objects, wherein he addresses this stagnation in producing substantial change today through the kind of impoverishment of our ability to create concepts for our reality. So it's quite simply, the failure to change the world may not be unrelated to the failure to understand it. So with those two quotes sort of in mind, in the background there'll be the kind of ghosts hovering over the talk. I'll get started. So knowledge claims have historically been idealized from an Archimedean point. So this is an imaginary vantage point that would theoretically allow us to observe reality from an objective distance. So since the 70s, however, feminist theories of knowledge have challenged this particular framing of objectivity from a distance. So the legacy of feminism's incursion into epistemology has been rather to situate knowledge claims, as Doreen was mentioning, by insisting on the significance of socio-normative contexts that underpin the production of all knowledge. So although there's no singular feminist epistemology, what feminist epistemologies in general highlight through their various lenses is the politicity of epistemology itself that manifests in the entanglements of knowledge claims with matters of gender, class, race, age, and social status. So as Linda Alcoff and Elizabeth Porter suggest, feminist perspectives on epistemology have, quote, reconfigured the borders between epistemology, political philosophy, and ethics, as we come to see the interrelationships and inseparability of these heretofore disparate issues, end quote. So tonight, as mentioned, I'd like to sort of extrapolate on this idea of situated knowledge by both updating it in view of distributed cognition, what we could sort of hold in our minds as pluri-situatedness, but also in terms of how knowledge works back upon us as concept-mongering creatures. That's a term that Ray Brassier uses that I love. So he talks about humans as concept-mongering creatures. So how knowledge works back upon us to effectively resituate in the process of thinking. So not only do we think from a situated spot, the activity of thinking, when it works upon you, can resituate you. So you're not ever stuck to your situation. And I think that's a really important, that's one point that I want to sort of insist on. So it's my claim that only in this way might we better grasp the complexity of our interdependent world that increasingly eludes us in an effort to find traction and forge modes of political mobility within it. So in tandem with the rise of feminist epistemologies, the late 70s also saw, of course, the emergence of science and technology studies, which goes by STS. So a discipline that focuses on the bidirectional ways in which sociocultural conditions affect scientific research and technological development, and of course, vice versa. This goes in both directions. So together, these late 20th century critiques of epistemic practices bore two important achievements. So the first is the dismantling of the purported neutrality of scientific activity, emphasizing instead social conditions that shape the construction of knowledge. And two, the shattering of the paradigm of perspective-free, bodiless knowledge production. So the standpoint of the knower can no longer be universally generalizable, but must always be viewed as historically contingent. So this is similar, because I know we were talking about this a little bit in emails as well before. This is similar to Foucault's theorization of what he calls the episteme. So this is the episteme is, of course, what prefigures knowledge, since it determines what can count, what is worthy of pursuit, and or what can be regarded as knowledge in certain socio-historical conditions. So what this boils down to is that all knowing substantively involves historical material situation, that is body, mind, and instruments of all particular knowers. So I think the other important thing these developments served was to deprivilege the traditional hierarchies within epistemology that have championed propositional knowledge, so this is knowing that, over material knowledge practices or knowing how. So as interventions go, these critiques, again, did not seek to obliterate objectivity entirely by relativizing or localizing scientific knowledge to such a degree as it would be equatable with religion or dogmatic beliefs. But rather they sought to ground theories of knowledge in relation to socio-cultural and material practices precisely to deny the facile separation between the objective and the objective. So it's a way to try to bring these two worlds together. So part 2 of this talk is on caricatures and deadlocks. So a little bit of a historical example here. So the tendency towards epistemic relativism that subsequently swept across much of the humanities as a result of these important contributions, often being taken up under the rubric of post-structuralism, they didn't sit well for many in the scientific community, that's to say the least. So perspectives that emphasized a socially and linguistically constructed world, which often deployed the word reality in scare quotes only, were deemed especially problematic. So the science wars, as they were called, began after the polemical publication of Higher Superstition, The Academic Left and Its Quarrels with Science in 1994, so of course this one here, by biologist Paul R. Gross and the mathematician Norman Levitt. But these wars were ultimately made very public by the Sokal affair, after the physicist Alan Sokal had an article accepted for a humanities journal called Social Text entitled Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity. That was the title of his essay. So in a subsequent text for the magazine Lingua Franca, Sokal revealed the article was a total hoax, suggesting that it had only been accepted because, quote, it sounded good, and B, it flattered the editor's ideological preconceptions, end quote. This elaborate prank created a lot of buzz. It was picked up in the media in the States and in France. But it only served to widen the chasm between the so-called two cultures of the hard sciences and the humanities, as C.P. Snow already wrote about in 1959. Falsely reducing the terms of the squabble to either pro-science or anti-science, pro-reason or anti-reason. While it's undeniable that there have been, dubious appropriations of scientific terms and concepts within the humanities, and this, I like to point out, continues in a lot of so-called critiques of AI, there have been some very broad caricatures painted by the so-called hard scientists who have lumped together diverse thinkers into a monolithic leftist academic culture. So debilitating reductions and misapprehensions have flown, of course, in both directions. But I'm not here to adjudicate really the Sokol affair example. Instead, I want to look at what was sacrificed in this exercise of mutually annihilating reductionism, and how our understanding of epistemology ought to orient itself today, along with its inherent political ramifications. So 20 years after the science wars, the popular cultural climate, primarily on the right, but also sometimes on the left, has taken this constructivist understanding of the creation of knowledge to the extreme, typically in pursuit of political, economic, and religious agendas, such as climate change denial, anti-vaccination campaigns, and of course, creationism. The Sokol movement has, in some sense, gone mainstream in the ways the alt-right propagates the conspiracy theory that American universities have been overtaken by Marxist, leftist boogeyman figures, proliferating in the horrific departments of gender, queer, and post-colonial theory, resulting in the deliberate erosion of traditional American values. This has led some of the founders of STS, like Bruno Latour himself, to question their role in highlighting the social aspects of knowledge construction in scientific practices, and to reconsider their analysis as an enabler for the proliferation of private interest and belief. So this is where they launch a discipline, they realize that it could be really taken up in quite unproductive, even destructive directions, and then they say, "Oh, did we do this? Did it go too far?" So even those proponents have been quite, active in acknowledging this. So in these warped instances, the relativization of epistemology has been so distorted as to negate its initial and ongoing import. This tendency does a disservice to the hard sciences and the humanities alike. So the results in science can be cherry-picked and funded on ideological grounds or out of self-interest, or used to stall action when labeled as inconclusive for the same reasons. And on the other hand, for the humanities that seek to rigorously analyze techno-scientific procedures without undermining their enterprise absolutely, or those who remain critical of technology without falling into debilitating pitfalls of, say, techno-scientific pessimism, where you just deny or denounce all technology absolutely. So it's important to recall that these incapacitating exaggerations of relativization were never the ambition of feminist epistemologies, which were in fact concerned with bolstering the scope of epistemology through the integration of formerly disregarded or unrecognized knowledges and knowledge practices, to correct gaping omissions that have served only to limit our understanding of the world. So beyond the divides between the so-called hard and soft knowledges, and what each can do respectively, the more ambitious question is not reducible to pro or anti-science. Rather, we should ask, how might we augment our definitions of epistemology so that they're not exclusively bound to Western scientific procedures? Who and what are the stakeholders in knowledge production? And thirdly, how can we open up knowledge and its instrumentalization into public scrutiny? And I think that's a really important point, because this is basically where knowledge gets used towards projects. So this is quite important, and it's not just, epistemology in this sense isn't just us sitting here in a university context patting ourselves on the back. It's got real social political implications. So part 3, and I think there's 6 parts, just so you get a sense. Worlds in common versus preference worlds. So in this extreme unintended deployment of epistemic relativization that I just sort of sketched out, this has contributed less to the desired multiplication of knowledges, less to a deeper sea of knowers, and a more robust grasp of reality, and instead has contributed to a climate of fractured, destabilized, irreal worlds. Gesundheit. In this scenario, partly fueled by the positive feedback loops of algorithmic automation and online personalization, a complex world in common has been forsaken for the simplicity, conformity, and reassurance of what I call preference worlds. So what we experience in our preferential techno-homophilic chambers is simultaneously a barrage of confirmation bias and an outrage at the biased other who is publicly mocked ad infinitum. So we make absolutely no headway on a shared account of reality. So this is basically talking about echo chambers in more everyday parlance. The temptation to react to this scenario by attempting to purify it by purging bias and falsehood echoes precisely those debunked idealizations of science as a neutral arbitrator of an objective reality with which we could all occur. At least that was the claim. So where does that leave us? How can we escape the reductive deadlock of the with us or against us negative lesson from the science wars that has leaked into our present? How can we account for situated, that's relativized or localized knowledge that is tethered to historical and geographic particularities, while still remaining vigilant in the collective pursuit and of an account of reality along with the political implications of that very pursuit? So because knowledge can never be severed from its makers or the conditions of its making, the stakes are inherently political, especially, again, to repeat, as epistemologies become instrumentalized. So this requires us to move from a plane of what Fabio Gironi identified as world-denying constructivism, and this would be the sort of parody or the exaggerated version of situatedness that forecloses on any claim on reality, even if that claim is always subject to fallibility. Requires that we transition to a world affirming constructivism so that we might be able to account for situated local variations and distributed planetary coherency. In other words, a world in common. This also calls up the conclusion of Achille Mbembe's text, The Critique of Black Reason. There's an insistence that there's only one world, there's only this one world, and it's, I believe, taken from using the expression tout monde from Edouard Glissant, but just to say that this insistence that there are, and the single world is a kind of collection of all these multiple worlds, but ultimately there is only one world. So part 4 is the cold world and existential situation. So it's as understandable that we'd be tempted to retreat into these bubbles of automated familiarity, confirming particular known knowledges, as it is wholly inadequate to our time. It's, of course, much more comfortable to be confirmed that you're always right and your model of the world is the correct one, but this is insufficient to where we need to go. This diagram may be a little confusing. We can talk about it later, but it's the only confusing one. So as Haraway insisted, we need a better account of reality. So one that measures up to the increasingly complex, abstract, insensible, and distributed qualities of our world in common. The task is made more arduous still by the fact that this world, as I just mentioned, contains many human and non-human worlds within it, as Achille Mbembe reminds us. So to transform our accounts of reality is to enable novel perspectives through which to maneuver and relate anew, where this reorientation allows us to better speculate on collective political navigation, rather than simply resorting to what was, what is, or what we think we know. So the world in common overflows and overwhelms us. But when the possibility for changing it is bound to our capacity, as Ray Brassey said, to better understand it, operating in a mode of complexity withdrawal, by emphasizing only the here and now of our concrete situation, leaves us cognitively and instrumentally enfeebled. So the expression cold world has been used to describe this overwhelming moment, precisely this insane level of complexity in which we live. So the artist Amanda Beach has defined the cold world as, quote, the alienation that we experience in relation to the complex world of big data, hyper-capitalism, and the apparent impossibility of fathoming or understanding what this world is, end quote. So importantly, the term cold world refers not only to the complex world out there, right, that confounds and sort of leaves us without much epistemic traction, but it also refers to our current existential crisis as humans within the world, what we could call our collective situatedness, our common self-understanding. So the term describes the paradoxical condition of a world that humans have fabricated, but a world in which the diverse constructed bits have amassed into this intricate amalgam, intentionally and otherwise, that no human brain can grasp, despite the fact that some of us have built it. So some human minds and bodies have intervened in the world to the degree of permeating and remolding its geological core, but at the cost of becoming impotent as individuals and as a species because of our dominance over the world. So this is just basically diagnosing the Anthropocene. This is in stark contrast to the narrative once presumed to be evidence of our mastery, which saw nature pictured as a mere backdrop for our actions. So the we evoked here is, of course, only a partial one, whose particular formulation is that of a Western logic that underpins our perverse present, which is basically a unilateral mode of globalization and not a global globalization. This existential crisis of the human in the face of our unfathomable world at both a local and planetary scale forces us to contend with an augmented, politically oriented, multi-scalar demand for a concept of situatedness that would account not only for our particular condition, as here localized in the geography, but for a generic human situatedness as well, and also for the ways in which these two modes are intertwined. So it's not only that you have the localized situation and you're part of a generic self-understanding of what the human is and what and where the human is, but how those two influence each other. So firstly, the objects of our time that require substantial epistopolitical mobilization are distributed and complex, meaning that although they produce empirical or local situated effects that can be sensed, like the weather, they only come into existence as a systemic whole via procedures of averaging. So this would be like the climate. Yeah, the climate isn't the rain, it isn't the snow, it's the collection of all this data over generations and built into statistical averages. So of course, there's some, American senators who bring a snowball into the Senate chamber and say, hey, there's snow in Washington, so climate change doesn't exist. So this is a very stupid example of when you confuse the particular with the average, how it just doesn't hold. It's just not true. So a plethora of types of knowledge is required to co-construct a diagram of this reality, a reality that is abstract and pluri-situated across bodies, materials, and knowledge practices, yet one that is coherent nonetheless. This is particularly true with something like the climate. The amount of diverse, even scientific knowledge, not to mention indigenous knowledge required to feed into our model of this very complex system is just incredible. Speaking once to a climate philosopher of science who specializes in simulation, it was totally shocking for me to hear that he said it takes about 100 years for them to build a coherent model that can then be used to build climate simulations, because there's just so much work and labor going into building this, which was so contrary to my initial assumption that we just must be shooting out these models every day now with computation and so on. It was very far from the case. So it's a very slow-going process. So the type of cognition required for better understanding these complex systems is in itself distributed. So in his study on the setting of the LIBOR interest rate in the UK, sociologist of finance Donald Mackenzie defines distributed cognition as, quote, multiple humans and objects that can do things individual humans cannot, requiring that one go beyond the cognitive science analysis of the individual bounded by the skin, end quote. This boils down to the need for epistemology to elaborate a concept of distributed situatedness in order to adequately grasp the complexity of our reality, and for complexity not to be dismissed through a romantic framing as sublimely impenetrable. We must seek to better diagram our reality in order to strategize better political purchase. So we can already see traces of diagrammatic activity around, which is good. So secondly, the megastructural scales through which computational and material procedures drive and organize our contemporary condition have resituated the human animal. We are no longer the radiant center of activity from which reality unfolds, is constructed, or is determinately controllable. So this play is known as the Copernican Humiliation. It carries with it the possibility of remapping human self-understanding both in and with the world in order to draw out other epistemological and logical approaches to it. So the conceptual integration of this humiliation is an important example of our exceptional unexceptionalism. Through our rather exceptional capacities for reasoning and self-reflection, we can come to realize we can be unexceptionally carved up into chemicals and atoms and DNA, in the end, not so far from a piece of fruit, to paraphrase Nina Power. This formula extends into our unexceptional boundedness to evolutionary processes, where an extinction is more a norm than an anomaly, so our survival, our exceptional status as surviving all of this is far from guaranteed. The second point amounts to the capacity of human reason to reach for something that may cause the human itself to be displaced. This new generically situated human self-image opens conceptual and material pathways for navigating the world otherwise, departing, as it does, from an altogether different perspective. So I think this has a lot of resonance with the general tone of the program, right? It's about navigating turbulences. So we're using a lot of these cartographic myths. They seem to be something that we share as a kind of common language. So today, the effective heat emanating from the experience of estrangement in the cold world can be read as a rejection, in some cases a total reactionary refusal, of this human decentering. Now, this rejection manifests itself throughout the political spectrum with vastly different consequences, from the making great again of parochial isolationism, coupled with its inherent racisms and sexisms, to the insistence on guarding against any infringement of the authenticity of lived experience as producer of particular and not universal truths. So while situated knowledge teaches us that epistemology cannot be divorced from socio-environmental context, perhaps more crucially is the question of how knowledge permeates and resituates us through this activity of thinking. Such is the principle of the inhuman, as articulated by Reza Negarestani. What this is a humanism pushed to its logical end, insofar as it constantly reopens itself to the universe, to produce knowledge that potentially destabilizes what it means to be human at any given historical moment. Inhuman situatedness is not fully determined. It is not bound to a fixed point or situation, but is subject to ongoing mobility. It's a project that is always in process, never ending. It is subject to mobility via the interpolation of knowledge. Mobile situatedness proceeds by way of generative alienation from one situation to another via encounters with the strange, where our understanding of what is and where we stand within it is enduringly reframed, including our relations with each other and with non-humans. So this mobility creates new vistas of interrogation while disabling others. The inhuman capacity for the revision of knowledge and for the transformation of self-understanding and values based on new knowledge is wholly contingent upon confrontations with the unknown, where our fallibility is a powerful driver of this revisionary capacity and not a signal of intellectual weakness. We additionally need a cultural transformation in this regard, to care for this fallibility as a generative force, instead of conceiving it as a shameful ineptitude, as is too often the case in academia today, driven by the imperatives of heroic authorial dominance. Fallibility, rather, is an indispensable property of knowledge co-creation. To reject or willfully neglect the unfamiliar or to disincentivize revision is to render situatedness immobile, or when situatedness becomes dogmatic, amounting to a misapprehension of situated knowledge that carries no possibility to exceed its own situation. So as discussed earlier, the challenge of creating a better account of our complex interdependent reality today, it supersedes the capacities of any single heroic human actor. Knowing our world, a knowing, of course, that will never be total or complete, can only be the result of bit-part intelligences, requiring massive collaborative efforts at an unprecedented scale. We must be able to actively integrate alien epistemologies, not only with regard to human transdisciplinary and transcultural necessities, but also with regard to non-human considerations that increasingly throw into question our presumed monopoly on intelligence itself. Of course, this is the AI or the AGI that is potentially around the corner. So if there was one defining thing that we said, okay, humans have the capacity for intelligence, we define it in purely anthropocentric terms, this is now no longer certain. In fact, it's likely it's false. This is like intelligence diversification. It could be a wonderful thing. So part 5 is the inexistent humanness. So I'll start this section with a quote from Alain Badiou's Logics of Worlds. So it must be possible to think in a world what does not appear within the world. Now, I've been using the words human and unhuman as if they've been self-evident blanket terms that universalize us into a common category, presumably hinting at the potential collective agency of that category. This, however, is too great a leap to be politically useful, and one reason why the legacy of situating knowledge remains of utmost relevance. While the human as a generic category is today essential, it is far from functionally, ethically, or pragmatically given. The planetary scale of something like climate change, it demands a response from a collective agent of a comparable scale, a generic human. But we cannot neglect the historical and continuing exclusivity of such categorical designations. Socially and politically, we cannot suddenly become universalized simply because we are now confronted with a species-wide threat, despite the scientific designation of us all as Homo sapiens sapiens. Are we now conveniently all supposed to be universally human just because we are facing a threat of mass extinction? If the capacity for reasoning is taken as the central property of the human, replete with its persistent inhuman drives, then political exclusion from this category is nothing less than an act of dehumanization. In view of the history of material and epistemological struggles around the category of the human, it would be misguided to imagine a sudden manifest sense of solidarity amongst members of this scientific category, even though we desperately need it. The category of human may hold scientifically, but the universality of this scientific classification doesn't measure up with the long-running political battles over the scope of its enclosure. So although there is an entrenched disconnect between this kind of universal scientific framing of the human and the non-uniform partiality of its manifestation, I don't think we should abandon this category. When all humans do not actually appear in the world, we must begin thinking and existing in the thought of a world in which they do. Our socio-environmental circumstances today require a stereoscopic integration of the generic category of the human, buttressed by inhuman drives to collectively resituate us. Now, this can be posited as a conflict between ontological and logical classifications. So in the ontological view, the category human exists, and all humans scientifically count in this view. In the logical view, which Alain Badiou defines as the legislation of appearing, or counting in the world, most humans, in fact, have been historically omitted from this measure. Those bodies and concepts that ontologically belong to the world, but logically do not count, are what are deemed as inexistent. The category of inexistence, drawn from Badiou, refers to a degree of existence that isn't nothing, but which operationally approaches zero. It's a kind of bare life, minimal being without counting. For the human to live up to its ontological reality, The collective battle is that of the transition from inexistence, or simply being, to existence, that is, appearing and counting. It's on this plane that we must fight for the coming into logical existence of the universal human, if this category is to gain political weight. It is only then that we could be said to exist in what we know, where epistemology is augmented beyond this purely propositional realm of simply knowing that, and transitions into knowing how. So without this logical becoming, we will remain bound to this inexistent human, a situation of generic humanity that is politically intractable and ensnared in a quagmire of merely knowing that we know the human is a collective category. While the category human is politically urgent and ontologically true, it will remain a veil for idealized ahistorical claims without consequence until it becomes logically manifest, that is, until it makes a political appearance. So the call for a stereoscopic synthesis that could bridge the distinctions between the scientific image of the world, this kind of abstract knowledge we have of ourselves, and the manifest image of it, this is how humans conceptualize themselves in the world, has been essential to the philosophical project of Wilfrid Sellars, the American analytic philosopher. Now, Sellars uses the term image in a usefully ambiguous way, and not to deny it the status of reality. So on the one hand, the image denotes the contrast between an object and its projection onto a plane, like a shadow. So the image exists, but is dependent on an object. And on the other hand, image is used to evoke the imaginary, which may or may not actually exist, but the imagination of it certainly does. The manifest image is not a naive entity subordinate to the scientific image. So there's no sort of hierarchy between, we're not like advocating another positivism where science will guide our naive selves. It concerns a shared domain of norms and action, leading to the claim that, quote, if man had a radically different conception of himself, he would be a radically different kind of man, end quote. This crucial difference entails a broader question, wherein the manifest image contextualizes our activity in mundane and epistemic registers alike. Namely, what kind of world in common ought to be constructed from the vantage point of this inhuman resituation. When a defining step of political reconstruction, in the words of Negarestani, is predicated on, quote, understanding and imagining what ought to be done in our world from the perspective of the postulated possible world, end quote. We need to begin by imagining the otherworldly consequences that a resituated inhuman image might entail. Now, this other world is inexistent insofar as it exists only as a possibility. It is not empirically available to us. It is accessible only by way of hypothesis, by way of careful, reasoned narrative constructions that exceed our known or accounted for reality. So we must demand a better account of reality for any epistemic project. But such work must also be extended into this hypothetical dimension. An epistemic project must be able to speculate on what is not yet accounted for, if knowledge is to forge pathways beyond the tyranny of the here and now, the tyranny of presentness, of existing perspectives, and critical deconstruction towards what could be or what ought to be otherwise. In other words, an epistemic project focused not just on the situatedness of knowledge, but also on how the apprehension of knowledge works upon us, transforms us, and resituates us, constituting new possibilities for relation building as a result. Planetary-scale crises that intersect multiple disciplines, material practices, cultures, and social ecosystems necessitate distributed cognition at an unprecedented proportion. Yet tackling these crises hinges on an inhumanist drive to resituate the human, contesting its dehumanizing borders. It is through this supplementary dimension of inhuman reasoning that we might mobilize for an inexistent other world foreclosed on in our existing account of the world in common. A reality that is partially constructed by us, but which is also humblingly indifferent and invariant to us. For art to depart from the perspective of the hypothetical is equal to the construction of conditions for experiencing the other world, a type of reasoned fiction that generates new cartographies for action in existing reality. Because of the novel vistas it makes compatible with sensation. So just to conclude, what these thoughts hopefully sketch out is a sort of mereological insistence. So that's the necessity, all that means is a necessity to think part to whole relations without falling into the trap of picking one side over the other. And I think this tendency that we're having towards reductionism is in part producing a lot of the stagnation that we're experiencing now. So although we've seen a welcome turn in discourses that draw our cognitive efforts in planetary-scale proportions, so I'm thinking of here people advocating for counter-hegemonically scaled political projects, large-scale computational models like Benjamin Bratton's The Stack. So we've seen a turn in discourses that point to this scale and decenter the human as a result. But there's been a tendency to either view this decentering as totally debilitating. So this is kind of like where people claim there's a loss of, we're losing our humanness and so on and so forth in this cold world scenario. So this basically, what it does is engender states of resignation towards reality. And on the other hand, we have the techno-fetishists who celebrate this decentering of the human because they just want to celebrate, blindly the efficiency of the machine, so to speak. So either of these perspectives, they only give us a very impoverished view of what's possible. To think basically this kind of this produces an impoverished view that actually limits the way that we may think how inhuman resituatedness could play out. So it's as ineffectual today to champion the insignificance of the human in favor of this grand picture of the technosphere as it is to insist on immediate first-person or authentic political agencies of the human in the face of massive abstract systems. Thinking and materially existing in our knowledge of multi-scalar reality requires corresponding models of subjectivity beyond our own presentness, bringing increasing urgency to Mark Fisher's call for the construction of a collective subject that could measure up to and transform these impersonal, abstract forces driving the crises of our time. This is important because these crises cannot be simply moralized away, right? You can't, as it was the point in his almost decades-old text now, you can't just jail a bunch of bankers, for example. There's a systemic, impersonal systemic structure in place, and that's where politics needs to learn how to negotiate on a structural level. So to intervene in the dismal trajectory of reality today, we need to use and not be used by the alienating forces of the cold world. To confront it not in the register of an incapacitating individual human alienation that leads to states of utter disconnection, but that of a collective and generically human alienation that can separate us from what is, moving us towards new modes of grasping and being grasped by the hypothetical otherworld. So I'll end with that, and thank you very much for your attention.